Right, the last session of the day before closing remarks and then the highlight, which is going to be the cocktails afterwards. So for this last part, we're going to be a bit more backwards looking and forwards looking. So have a discussion about some of our predictions for what we think might happen and comparing experiences across different generations. So yeah, the theme of this, it's called the Our Generations panel. So we've got some people from different backgrounds, and we're going to be sharing experiences about what has happened, what we think will happen, what's changed over the courses of each of our professional journeys, and then have a bit of a prediction about what's in store by 2030. I did give away earlier that I'm Generation Z. I won't give away which members of the panel are from which generation. But I'd like to welcome up Su-Ling Voon, who's the Managing Director at Morgan Stanley, Stephen Xavier Chan, Head of Government Relations for APAC at PayPal, and Siufung Law, who's a genderqueer advocate and does teaching at the University of Hong Kong. Yeah, take a seat, everybody. Su-Ling, if I could begin with you, what are the determinants of more positive outcomes for LGBT people or better diversity and inclusion environments? What kind of factors lead to the kind of changes that have been spoken about earlier in the day?
I think it's, and much of that was said in the previous panel, but it's mainly about having conversations and being the ability to be more open.
Yeah.
So just speaking from my personal sort of journey as an ally, I would say that from quite a young age, I was personally quite impacted by some people that I knew who were LGBT, who'd been bullied at university, as well as some in my family who had had not very negative experiences as LGBT+. And so fairness and equality was always part of the way that I thought. But when, I suppose, about 10 years ago, the opportunities came up through the office, through Morgan Stanley, to get more involved, it still felt like quite a brave decision, because it was not a discussion that a lot of people were having in the office. And I would say that that continues to be the main changer, I think, for mindsets and cultures, is the ability to have conversations. But there are sort of catalysts for those discussions. So obviously setting up employee networks and having people like myself and a lot of my colleagues involved is very key, who prepared to put energy and to give a voice for the initiatives. But also a lot of the events in Hong Kong, changes in law, the evolution of law in the region, and in particular the participation by firms like ours in the QT case and supporting the Equal Opportunities Commission's statement on anti-discrimination, have a very important impact in terms of stirring discussion as to why we're getting involved and really affirming company values. Another very important point is the multiplier effect of social media. So from a personal as well as a corporate standpoint, we see publicity given to both negative and positive news. So we talk about the Taiwan same-sex laws, that's very positive, but also the backlash over the penalties in Brunei a few weeks ago, and some of the very prominent role models, the support and criticisms have very enormous impact when they're filtered through the social media. So I would say the dialogue, we've had the benefit of more dialogue through corporate life, as well as outside of corporate life, and it's been quite a happy marrying of personal values with corporate values.
And how has it evolved, do you think, being an ally in a company in Asia? How much easier is it now than 10 years ago? I guess it's a bit easier. Is it easy, or is it still a bit tricky?
It's a lot easier. I mean, as I mentioned, I think my personal values were always aligned. And when I first got involved, I chair our Legal and Compliance Diversity Committee, and when an opportunity came up, I think it was around 2011, to have an outside speaker come in and talk about these, I felt that it was a brave decision. I would say that the advocacy and participation in the QT case, in particular, was able for us to really get the dialogue into a much more open space amongst my colleagues and and globally. So I would say that as a result, you then gather a lot of allies and you move forward from that. And so I would say it's a lot easier now than it was previously. We still have a lot of work to do, but I would say that there's more willingness to engage in the discussion. It's certainly, I don't feel any more, not just myself, but the others who are involved, all of us who are involved now feel that, yes, you know, we can definitely have these conversations. It's no longer as taboo as it used to be.
So that's within the business community. What about in people's personal and family lives? Do you see non-traditional families becoming more accepted throughout the course of, I guess, the previous decade? Like, have you seen that happen? We had a session earlier on religion and traditions in Asia, where some of that was raised. Have you seen any change? Do you think there will be more change?
I definitely think there will be more change. So I have two daughters, 12 and 16, who are at school in the UK. And I would say that they are growing up in a world where they are much more exposed to LGBT issues at an earlier stage than in my generation. I would say they have LGBT clubs at school. They know, both my children know LGBT children in their own year, and they even know at least one, possibly two, who are actually transsexual or identifying as transsexual. So the next generation are growing up with much more LGBT awareness than perhaps in my generation. I think also as the laws are evolving and you see more rights for same-sex couples and for same-sex marriage, even if same-sex marriage is not yet recognized in Hong Kong, we will see more people having families, and our children will be at school and we'll see these families around them. So yes, it's an inevitable change of society.
Okay, Stephen, can I bring you in here? So if we start first with maybe the last 10 years, right? So thinking about what's developments over the last decade. If you look at where Asia was 10 years ago, where it is now, do you feel disappointed or pleased with the rate of progress?
So I'm from Gen Z, right? So I don't have a lot to reach back to. Just kidding. But first of all, thank you to the Economist for having me here. Today, I'm extremely inspired by all the speakers, you know, their personal stories, their motivation, the challenges they face, and in that, you know, the tenacity to go forward, you know, from Madam Jing to Danielle to June. You know, I have some single friends I would like to introduce you to. But, you know, looking back, I think technology has been the factor that has shifted and changed the landscape for LGBT, right? And I think about three areas. One is connection, second is empowerment, and third is changing of mindset, right? And some of that has been talked about earlier in other panels. But I think just the connection, right? If you think about everyone here today, the connections that you made that got you here, and you level that up to the Hong Kong level and global level, right? And just technology enables us to mobilize when you know, advocacy or sharing resources, right? Taking us, you know, not talking about productivity and performance from a business perspective, but from the grassroots mobilization, where technology has been the key factor, right? Empowerment from a individual consumer perspective, right? You know, with the technology, any device that you have, you're empowered to make decisions, you're empowered to organize, start a business, you're empowered to respond when you see discriminations from a corporate perspective, from an individual perspective, that the response has been amazing, right? From the Cathay ad all the way to what has happened in Brunei, right? And lastly, in terms of changing of mindset, you know, we talk about social media, right? And survey after survey, the younger generation, Siufung and myself included, I'm just joking. You know, it's indisputable that over 80% see that LGBT rights and equality is fundamental, and you see that shift in the mindset. And social media has played a key role in shaping that development. So I think the past 10 years has been extremely positive in terms of LGBT progress. Of course, not to say that we still don't have much more to go. There are real challenges still exist in all aspects of society. Yeah, but I do think that has been kind of a key factor in this space.
And what do you think comes next? What are the next things you're looking forward to or expecting to happen? I mean, in the last panel, Thailand and Japan were mentioned. Do you think that's right?
So when I think about the next 10 years, I think about opportunities and challenges, right? And I think about the way the economy is changing, the way that business is changing, and businesses around the table, around here, and my company included, right, are constantly shifting, right? And as business shift in line with the economy and the industry, right, there is a concerning trend that D&I now, when they look at cost cutting, D&I now has become dispensable. And so we have seen some roles that have been eliminated off the bat, right? And when I think about D&I, I think about LGBT inclusion. It's like a marriage. It's easy to celebrate D&I when there are successes, right? It's easy to recognize that. But when the challenges is tough, that's when a relationship, a marriage is being tested. Similar for any business, right? When you are losing revenue, when the economic times are tough, when growth are not there, who do you cut first? And when D&I positions are being identified as something that is dispensable, then it really speaks to the priorities that business place in D&I, and I'm seeing a concerning trend that's taking place around the region, that D&I positions are slowly being eliminated as business are shifting and costs are cutting. So that's one challenge. The other challenge, I see that LGBT employees, LGBT advocates, allies, we all have full-time jobs. And as jobs are being replaced by machines, as jobs are being eliminated due to automation and AI, the business case for D&I slowly disappear, because you can have all the policies and infrastructure in place, but if you don't have employees there, right, what will happen to D&I, right? That will have a chilling effect, because then that will impact funding support for NGOs, funding advocacy in the community. And I think we have to start looking at that, the impact of the changing in the workforce and how that will cascade down to the D&I workspace, LGBT inclusion, women's equality, all the aspects of D&I, right? But I also see there are opportunities in the next 10 years as we move towards more of an online marketplace. As you think about online platform, companies are becoming the trend. Companies such as Airbnb, Uber, Grab, the reach will be incredible. So you have the corporate employees that work for these companies, but there are millions more that are now part of the share economy, right? And so now the reach will be much more impactful. And if companies, does it right in terms of providing the right training, providing the right type of initiatives in place, that change could be massive from a business perspective.
What have been the most notable changes that you've seen in the workplace or in your kind of work and business environment through your career?
So a little bit about my career. So I've been in Asia for now almost 10 years. So spent 2 years in China, the last 5 years in Hong Kong, relocated to Singapore the past 8 months. And what I have seen in terms of changing is mindset. So now it's more of a reverse business case of LGBT inclusion. When I came to Hong Kong in 2014, the question that I get asked constantly when I push for LGBT inclusion, same-sex benefits, is why? Why do we need it, right? And the burden's always been on allies, advocates, LGBT champions, to put forth a business case, to put forth data, to put forth reasons behind why we need certain policies or infrastructures or support in place. Now, when I participate in industry events, whether it's open for business platforms, community business events, interbank events. It's always, why not? Why don't you have these policies in place? So it's a more of a reverse business case. And when I now the co-lead for the Pride Network in Singapore, I'm being asked by our business leaders, why don't we have these programs in place? Why are we not being at the forefront of driving some of these initiatives? So it's a great change of mindset for that, in terms of a reverse business case for LGBT inclusion.
Yeah, okay, thanks. You talked about technology before, and I'd like to bring in Siufung on that. So clearly, big development in society over the last decade has been the rise of social media from a niche activity to something everybody does, and technological developments and communication becoming a lot cheaper and also a lot more widely available. So mobile phone usage and access very high, access to the internet very, very high. What have been your experiences about how social media is affecting the environment for LGBT in Asia?
Yeah, first of all, I think of because I do not come from a background of corporate, so I would talk more about on the individual level. So I think that technology, in particular, like social media and even like dating apps, have actually mobilized the LGBT movement across not only on a community or corporate level, but also on a very individual level. And it's become more intersectional and more global. So for me, in these past few years, you can see that there are a lot of LGBT movements that is very greatly inspired by the internet or social media or Instagram. There are all sorts of hashtags, right? Like Me Too movement, He for She movement, Black Lives movement, and the Black Lives Matter. And the Trans Lives Matter is actually inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement as well. So you can see how the whole social media or the internet platform has been becoming more and more intersectional, that crosses not only on gender sexuality but also across race and different gender issues. So I would like to share some of my own experience. So when I first began my advocacy some years ago, in which social media was beginning more and more important. And at that time, it was Facebook and YouTube. I don't know if you're still using YouTube right now, but YouTube as one of those very important platform, especially for transgender and gender non-conforming communities, to actually get in touch with other people, similar people in the world. So I had always wanted to be a YouTuber from the very beginning, because I saw YouTubes from all these influencer, putting up their transition whatsoever, the transformation channels online. But because the mainstream media didn't really have a lot of discussions or communication or dialogues about communities other than the mainstream ones, the heterosexual communities, you are unable to get any information about transgender or gender fluidity just based on very traditional media. So I had always wanted to be a YouTuber, but I put on some YouTube channels, but I realized no one watched it. So it was kind of unsuccessful. So what I did was I turned to traditional media and started to do a lot of media coverage about a lot of times about my own story, but also my advocacy about the possibility about gender being more fluid, being more queer in a sense. And that helps. So sometimes what I want to point out is social media plays an important role when it's in collaboration with a lot of times traditional media as well. And I remember in the past, maybe 5 years ago, when transgender people, when we grouped together, especially when I was hanging out with some of my trans men's friends, we talked so much about surgeries, doctors, all these hormonal replacement surgeries, etc. Now, when we gather, what we would do is we'll talk about who to follow on Instagram, or who are the ones that. And then a lot of times, because I'm also a professional bodybuilder, when people come to me, they would ask me, like, can you make me like this guy on social media, like to be that, muscular, handsome. I cannot make them more handsome. I can make them more muscular, not more handsome. But you can see that the influence of social media has been becoming more and more prominent. So looking into the future, I think that in social media, we need more, for example, in terms of Asia, we need more like Asian representation about like all these influencer, whoever you call them, social media influencer, or people who can really reach out to more individuals, especially the younger generation. I'm a bit old. I think of like, because I'm not the kind of people who are very I live in the age of Facebook, but now everyone using IG and social. So I'm catching up the trend. I'm still getting up more followers. But in terms of that, I think advocates or even activists could also like making more use about the technology, about social media to actually like to advocate the ideas and the ideals and etc. The other experience is a dating app experience. So I identified this was not. It has to write as official title. So I'm also identified as a genderqueer, as a gender fluid. So I'm biologically female, socially male, and I'm also a professional female bodybuilder. So it's too complicated for a lot of people already. So especially when you're going to use like dating apps, and I'm also identifying as a pansexual. So I'm attracted to people regardless of their gender, and it confuses people most of the time. And because like you put on when you put on images or photos on dating apps, I usually put the best ones. So I put on topless ones. So people start to say, oh, they assume that I'm a man biologically whatsoever. So going back to a few years, 5 or 7 years before, I use Grindr, so because I'm also attracted to men, but it's really hard for like gender non-conforming people to actually have a platform or space to actually discuss about their sexuality. And I encounter a lot of like moments in which the man that I dated didn't know that I'm a biologically woman, and when you go intimate, and then before you get that, you have to explain, and a lot of times they were just, they just cannot believe or accept that. But you can see that in these few years, dating apps like I still am trying with a lot of dating apps. A lot of dating apps are getting more and more inclusive on the individual level, but still you can see that a lot of them, for example, they do not allow me to pick my biological gender as both men and women, so I don't know which one to pick sometimes. But you can see that in terms of like the choices of your sexuality or your gender identity, it's getting more and more like inclusive. I can pick genderqueer, for example, and I still attracted mostly like a cisgender men. Because I put on topless photos, but still, it actually encourages people to actually discuss about all these different terminologies or identities that is more and more of importance in the coming decades, like terminologies or ideas about being more fluid in terms of your gender expression and gender identity. So I can foresee that in the future we will be having more and more conversation on like terminologies or topics or issues regarding to transgender community, of course, and the gender non-conforming communities as well.
Okay, one future trend. Actually, yeah, Su-Ling, I wanted to bring you in about your views on social media, friend or foe.
Well, I think we're all acknowledging the power of social media and the multiplier effect. I mean, inevitably, I was at an event to celebrate Idaho a couple of weeks ago, and one of the organizers said to me, this is being live streamed. So obviously, if people couldn't make it there in person, the huge advantage is that they're able to view it online, and it's recorded and then shared and so forth. So it has huge power in terms of bringing the message to thousands of people. We do have to be careful, though, particularly in Asia, where we do have some closed societies. I think there were discussions earlier about some of the jurisdictions where we have Sharia law. And certainly there are other jurisdictions where being LGBT is still illegal, and so effectively the LGBT community have actually gone underground. So if you are an advocate and you're using social media as your platform, you are to a certain extent also vulnerable, because you're then identifiable. The second point is that whilst dating apps, is definitely to be welcomed, and I think for a lot of the community who are in these closed and restricted societies, it also doesn't necessarily bridge them with the broader populace. I mean, it helps them bridge with each other, but doesn't necessarily help them get to the broader sort of ally community. And so that's an aspect which we'll need to sort of tackle going forward.
I've got one more question, but I'll put it on hold and give the audience a chance to come in. We've got one that's come in through the event app, which is about media. So are movies and TV shows produced in Asia and elsewhere also affecting change? Does the inclusion of LGBT characters in those shows make a difference?
Yeah, I think in recent years we have been there have been a lot of discussions about having transgender actors on screen, and I think it is very important to feature different types of sexuality and gender identity with actors who identified as such. So, and if we have more, it's not only about featuring LGBT characters, but it's also about having, these characters are being played by, LGBT people themselves. So, and it would definitely give a more positive and mobilizing change to the community and also to the public who are willing to know more about, the individual stories of these people, and of course, the characters in those plays or movies.
Great, wait, question here. Okay, everyone else gets priority over Michael, but if he gets his hand up, then he can go.
Thanks. So I think the conversation around Generation Z, and kind of their workplace needs and interests and whatnot is very popular among MNCs and global companies, but I am kind of skeptical about how much this is sort of seeped into the management discussion at much more local companies. And so I'm kind of curious to get, especially Su-Ling and Stephen, your opinion about how local companies, company partners that you work with in your markets here in Hong Kong or Singapore, wherever you operate, are thinking about this. I mean, do they seem to have an idea that the young people that they hire want to be more inclusive also, or are they just kind of work units?
So I'll just kick off. So I mean, we're on the platform here. I'm on the platform here. Because for various reasons. I think one of them I would like to say is that because my company really takes this very seriously. And why do they take it seriously? There's a personal and sort of ethical values aspect to it, but also companies recognize the business case for having diversity and the better business outcomes from having a diverse and inclusive workplace. So when we look at the generations coming in and looking at the environment that they are growing up in developing, and the attitudes that they're coming in, it's about modernization. So what we're doing is really preparing our workplace to be an attractive place for our talents and also for retention. So yes, I think I think I would say that for ourselves, yes, we do take it very seriously. I think that people understand the symbolic importance of the position, the platform that we have, the reach that we have with our clients and also with our vendors, and having diversity policies which are actually effective. I think I can sort of speak from my own personal experience in the sense that we in the Legal and Compliance Department actually had a survey amongst all of our legal providers to find out what their attitude was and really to diversity and inclusion. And that was an important message, not only to receive information, but it was really for us to signal to our legal providers that this is really an important, this is a very important value that we have. And we look for it amongst our providers because we understand the business result that we get, the better business result we get from having diverse and inclusive providers.
So I'd like to dissect that question a little bit to multinational versus local companies. I think that was part of your question. I think for multinational companies, absolutely correct, right? companies with global footprints really understands the importance of the incoming workforce, the importance of emerging consumers in the space. So clear cut the business cases there, right? And I think senior management absolutely buys into it, provides a lot of resources to drive that thinking and change throughout the organization. I think for local businesses, it's still a very challenging proposition. And I will tell you why, right? I think in Singapore, for example, you think about small, medium-sized business, right? They are struggling with basic daily needs, right? Of not having even technology for if you take kind of PayPal space in the payments area, they don't even have a technology to process payments, right? So if they don't have the fundamental needs to have a business to survive in a local market, and not talking about global footprints that many don't have, how could they even think about future workforce issues, right? It's probably at the low part of the radar, right? And you're talking about hawker center businesses. These are food court, mom and pop shops. You talk about small, medium-sized businesses, right? They're thinking about how to scale their business. They're thinking about how to get their products out. They're thinking about how to be competitive in this space, right? And it's a very competitive, cutthroat space, right? However, though, recognizing that, I think the government has stepped in, and of all the jurisdictions that I've overseen in my job, I think Singapore is one of the leading countries that really think it through strategically how to build a future workforce. And so there are dozens of government and quasi-government organizations that are working hand in hand with businesses and local businesses to understand what their needs are, what are their gaps in skill sets, what can they do to build that ecosystem, and how can they partner MNCs with local companies to help develop the ecosystem, because the MNCs have the resources, they have the know-how, and for MNCs, they want to be committed to that market space, right? And so I think from a Singapore perspective, they've done a wonderful job in driving that thought leadership, that preparation for the future workforce. In other jurisdictions, not so much. And I think it really depends on the maturity of the markets. It really depends on the maturity of the economy in that space. I think Hong Kong is a mix. When I was here, in the fintech space, talent is the #1 challenge for all fintech companies, right? And that speaks to the maturity of that ecosystem in talent development.
Okay, question over here. While the mic's going over, I'll just give you a heads up. After me, Charlie's going to be on stage and doing the wrap up for the day. He's going to be asking you, rather than him giving his key takeaways, he's going to be asking you for yours, and it's going to be contributions from the floor for our conclusion. So start thinking about anything you'd like to add to that discussion. But yeah, question over here.
I'm Anu from Bricola Consulting. We do research in the diversity and inclusion space. And one of the questions we are grappling with right now for a client is how important is D&I in the whole perception of the employer brand to potential talent. Like, there's a lot of research to suggest that diverse talent is more likely to quit as compared to other talent. But do we know anything about potential talent, people sitting outside and especially on campus? Are they today looking, diverse talent sitting on campus, looking actively at the messages they're getting from companies on diversity and inclusion?
Okay.
I'll just take that.
Yeah.
So I think, obviously, financial services firms like us are recruiting at very young levels every year. Recruitment is a very big task for us every year, and to attract the right people and to make sure that we're perceived as a place of choice for new employees is vitally important. What we also realize is that the new generations are really wanting to come to work. They want to feel that there is a purpose to their work, but they also want that to transcend beyond their day-to-day work. They want to know that the environment that they're working in is going to be supportive, not just if they happen to be LGBT, but that it is actually a modern environment. So I would say, yes, it is taken very seriously.
If I can maybe throw the panel a twist on that kind of angle, because we talk about recruitment, which is the people entering the workforce. But one challenge, or maybe not actually a challenge, just a situation that many countries in Asia have is every year more people are leaving the workforce than entering it. So China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, even Thailand now, more people leaving the workforce than entering. So in terms of the broader social picture, actually a lot of to get community support or public support for some of the changes that we've been discussing all day, we actually need to communicate with the older generation, right? And they're going to be an increasing share of the, well, voters in democracies or just people or the workforce in all places. How can we reach those people? And how do we go about changing the attitudes of the older generation?
So this is my personal view, and I think we have given up on that, sadly. I do think that if you talk to many people in the diversity space and you look at the survey, right, it's inverse, right? The younger generation, a lot of support. The older generation, you see an inverse in the data, right? And there's a brush off saying, oh, well, you know, they will kind of disappear. And so then, you know, the space will change. I think that's a very depressing and sad ways to look at it. I do think that older people have the capacity for change. When I came out at age 30 to my parents, I always thought that my parents in their 60s will not change. Like I fear that they will disown me. And for a long time, that was like the worst nightmare because I respect my parents a lot, and that would be one thing that would kill me, right? And my mom, my dad, you know, have very anti-LGBT views before, and associate LGBT to, sorry, I'm making me cry if I think about that, to sex worker, to drag queens, and that's all they thought about that. And they thought, are you a cross-dresser? Are you, you know, are you sick? But then they saw that I was normal. They saw that I have LGBT friends, and they came around 180 and fully accepted me, fully accepted the partners that I brought to home, and sent them stuff before they even sent me stuff, right? When I was away, and that really showed me that you know you can't teach old dogs new tricks, and older people have the capacity for change, because it's all about relationship, it's all about connection, it's all about sharing your story, it's all about being brave, and that's why I admire those people who spoke before me, and their tenacity, their bravery, their courage. It's all about that really matters, and the older generation have struggled through that, and they can associate with that, and when they see that, and they see that you struggle with it, then they'll love you for who you are. And so I think that we should not give up on the older generation, and we should make an attempt to change their minds, because once they change their mind, they would love you 110%.
And agree with that. Like, I also come from a very conservative family. So my father is a high school principal, and my mother is a civil servant. So it took my father like 15 years to actually accept who I am. So I have been changing throughout my life about my sexuality and stuff. So it actually took him like 7 years to accept that I could be with girls as a lesbian. And after that, I've already changed. And become more like trans-masculine. So for a period of time, I have been identified as a transgender man. And it actually took him another 8 years to accept me as more like a trans-masculine, maybe trans man. And he didn't know that I have already become more fluid. But I can see changes. Like he has been like trying so much to change. So for instance, like for example, in my area in sports, people used to see me as a woman, as a woman athlete. When I took my father to the gym, like I persuaded for 2 years, and then recently I took him to the gym. He thought I was seen as a man, so he tried to reach out to people and said, oh, my son is like that and that, when people were getting so confused. But I can see like all these like changes from the older generation, even like from people who are, you know, from sectors or disciplines who are more like traditional, more conservative, like towards like LGBT inclusion. So I can actually see a change, you know, and in particular with all these changes in technology and stuff, it can actually mobilize, you know, older generation to have more understanding about the younger generation.
Great. Well, the clock's ticking, so unfortunately we'll have to finish it off there. But if you didn't get a chance to put your question, you've got one last moment to put it into Charlie's conclusions, and then we'll move off into our drinks reception afterwards. But before we do that, please join me in thanking Su-Ling, Stephen, and Siufung for their contributions.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks. Oh.
It's okay.